Good morning, and welcome to AMSA's webinar titled Recognizing and Assisting Victims of Labor Trafficking. My name is Sabrina Dimitra, and I'm AMSA Settlement and Integration Program Manager, and I will be facilitating today's webinar. Before we begin, I would like to thank the Government of Canada through their Migrant Worker Support Network project for funding today's event. So before we get started with the content portion and before I introduce our speaker for today, I just wanted to mention that our agenda will be that we'll have Larissa Maxwell from the Salvation Army be presenting the content, followed at the end of the webinar by a Q&A session. So I'd like to just introduce Larissa, and before we hand it over to her for the content portion. Larissa is the Director of Anti-Human Trafficking Programs at the Salvation Army British Columbia Division and has over 15 years working specifically with survivors of human trafficking and exploitation. Larissa leads 5 national anti-human trafficking programs, including the Salvation Army's Deborah's Gate, a high-security rehabilitative program for survivors of labor and sex trafficking, which has been operating since 2009. Larissa has an extensive experience as an instructor, keynote speaker, and international advocate. Larissa is also a professional artist and leads art therapy with survivors in each of the anti-human trafficking programs. She was the first recipient of the Canadian Department of Justice Excellence and Victim Services Award in 2017 and is featured in the labor trafficking documentary Hidden in Plain Sight: Labor Trafficking, Farm Workers, and Migrant Workers in Canada. So welcome, Larissa, and thank you for leading and sharing your expertise and knowledge with our webinar participants today.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here and to share with you today. I'm going to get us started. So today we're going to focus on the issue of human trafficking and exploitation. We're going to look at some of the realities, the identifiers, some strategies, and best practices in supporting migrant workers who may be experiencing exploitation or trafficking. I do have my contact information there, so you are more than welcome to get in touch with me afterwards. Today we're going to start and actually talk a bit about the issue of trafficking, and then we're actually going to transition and talk more about our programs. So for some of you here today, you might be familiar with the issue of human trafficking, and for some this might be newer. Oftentimes when we're talking about the issue of trafficking, there's a lot of conceptions of what it looks like, and especially because we're supporting migrant workers, there also is different forms of trafficking throughout the world. Often in the media, we do see trafficking shown in a way that, you might see pictures of individuals of a certain ethnicity or background. You might see bars or chains, and those are images that often do relate to trafficking in other countries. However, in Canada, we see a bit of a different view of trafficking. So I want to start first with a core competency in understanding what does exploitation mean. Exploitation actually is a charge in our criminal code, but I have a more simple definition for us to get our mind around. Exploitation is treating a person unfairly to benefit from their work. So I'll give you a simple example. We may have a migrant worker come to Canada for a certain job, and they may have been told what that job would look like. And when they get here and they start the job, some terms have changed. So they thought they'd be making minimum wage, and the employer then informs them, actually, we're not able to pay you minimum wage. They may have thought that they're working a certain amount of hours, and the employer says, well, actually, we need everyone to work 10 to 15 hours a day. They thought that they would be making overtime compensation, or maybe they didn't even know about overtime compensation, and they're not being paid for that. We may also see some behavior towards the migrant worker that is inappropriate and not appropriate for a workplace. That could look like degrading comments, that could look like a hostile work environment. So often exploitation is the building block that leads up to human trafficking. But in that example I shared, is that trafficking in and of itself? No, it's exploitation, and it's still wrong. There's still contraventions of employment standards, our BC Labor Code, but it doesn't meet the criminal code threshold of trafficking yet. But it's important to understand, because most migrant workers that you'll come across, probably what you'll spot first is exploitation, and that's typically where it begins. There is a spectrum of labor exploitation. You'll notice that on one side, you have an individual with their personal agency, which means they have control. They're setting the terms of their employment. They don't have anybody who is putting measures of control. And you notice that there's a spectrum that they can actually move towards a circumstance where they start to lose control. And so we've seen this happen in a few different industries in British Columbia and throughout Canada. We've seen it primarily for caregivers, especially through the live-in caregiver program, hotel industry, fishing industry, farming, any kind of agriculture. We also see a few other components tied in. We have seen individuals who have not only been exploited by an employer or employers, they also have been sexually assaulted by that same employer. So now we're actually looking at both sexual and labor exploitation. We have seen some who have been forced into labor who are not being paid at all, which really is starting to look like a form of slavery where someone is actually being treated as if they're the property of someone else. You may remember there was a case of this that came forward from West Vancouver a few years ago. So we do see this in Canada. We also see visa fraud as a component tied in. We can see unsafe work, and there has been a few cases as well of child labor and or of migrant workers coming and their children also experiencing a level of exploitation. So today I have a few inputs from survivors of labor exploitation themselves. You'll notice that this was provided with permission, meaning that survivors engaged with us in what's called an ethical storytelling process. So that means that they're not re-exploited through the process, they're empowered and educated. We do want to raise up their voice, but we do want to protect their confidentiality, especially since many of them are in recovery. So this input is from a survivor who's going to go by the name Lou Adele, but that's not her name. She's from here in British Columbia, but she was a migrant worker from another country who came as a caregiver. She said, "It's hard to live in chaos when you're experiencing exploitation. As a survivor of labor trafficking, I was trapped in the situation. When people are exploiting you, they abuse and manipulate you. The moment you think there is no hope is the moment you are also going to give up. It's hard when your exploiters promise you a better life, and you hold on to it even though they're stepping on you and your ego. You just want to perform your job and do what you need to do to survive. I remember the days where I got up, I put a mask on top of my real self, hiding behind it because I just wanted to do my job." I think this input from a survivor is really important for us to hear from her voice, because in her case, the exploitation went on for over a year and a half. And some might say, well, if it was so bad, why didn't you leave? And you can see in her case that there actually were people depending on her. Many migrant workers, as we know, that's the case. They actually have people who are dependent on their income. Number two, what other options did they have, especially if your permit is tied to your employer? And did she know yet of any legal resources or assistance in British Columbia to assist her? She was new to the country, new to the language. And so I just wanted to share that to give you a sense of what happens for those who are experiencing exploitation and why it's challenging for them to come forward. So let's move forward from exploitation. When does exploitation become trafficking? Human trafficking is controlling a person for the purpose of exploiting them. So not only are you exploiting them, you're getting a benefit from them, you are also now putting measures in place to control them. So in many circumstances, we've seen violence be used. We have seen threats of removal and deportation. We have seen fines and garnishing wages for no reason. We've seen individuals in some cases physically confined, or they're very isolated. If you imagine some of our agricultural workers, they're often in very remote locations, construction workers, those that are working on work camps, they're not close to other cities. And so for them to be able to leave and access support is really challenging. We've had some survivors even be in spaces where there isn't even cell phone range, so they're not able to reach out for help. And we do see perpetrators of human trafficking use all kinds of different measures of control. Sometimes they use more coercive control, where they'll make subtle threats towards the worker or the worker's family back home. We have seen them hold on to ID, which is a criminal offense in Canada, to hold on to someone's ID without their permission. We have also seen them use different levels of guilt. So for example, as caregivers, they might say, well, you can't leave our family. Our family's dependent on you. We even knew of a caregiver where the family said to her, if you leave, we won't feed our animals anymore, and they're going to die because of you. So different levels and measures of control may be used to keep a person in a circumstance of exploitation. So those are some simple definitions, but I wanted to give you a bit of a framework. In 2000, all of the countries in the UN came together to determine a clear definition of human trafficking. Before that, a lot of countries had different definitions. And what happened was perpetrators were bouncing around between countries. So for example, in Bulgaria, if there was, less stricter penalties, they may go there versus being in Russia. And, we saw these migration patterns of traffickers happening throughout the world. And so the countries came together to determine a clear definition. But the problem is trafficking can look very different. It never happens exactly the same way. In my 15 years, I've actually never seen two cases look exactly the same. And so they put together this protocol. And if you'll notice, in 2002, Canada joined. Interestingly enough, Canada has been very, very late to the conversation of trafficking. I think for Canada, in some respects, we're comfortable knowing that it happens in other countries, but it shocks us to think it could happen here. And yet it is happening here. And it's often happening to migrant workers who are coming to fill jobs that Canadians don't want to fill. They're caring for our children. They're running many of our local businesses. They're tending our farms and our agriculture. And so the countries came together with the commitment to prevent, to protect, to prosecute, and build partnership around just supporting trafficked persons. So you'll notice in the first category there's an act. So the act could be recruiting someone. It could be transferring or even harboring, receiving or giving a benefit. That's usually the start of when it's happening. And how they actually keep someone in a circumstance of exploitation is measures of control. So those measures of control are listed there: violence or threats of violence, coercion, in some cases abduction, although I'll say in Canada that's a lot less than we see in other countries. And then we see fraud and deception as well. How many migrant workers are brought to Canada for jobs they thought they were going to do, and that's actually not why they're here. They're here for something completely different, and it was organized in a completely different way, and they were unaware of that. And the last is that you'll see the purpose. So it might be for forced labor, might be sexual exploitation, might be slavery, servitude, and in some circumstances, mostly outside of Canada, we also see organ removal. I have worked with a survivor who has had organs forcibly removed, but it happened in another country. And so when she came here to Canada, she'd experienced a different form of exploitation while she was here. I always like to zoom out a little bit just so that people understand that human trafficking is a form of modern day slavery. When you objectify and treat someone that way, that is the same pattern that we have seen throughout history. And in fact, there's different kinds of slavery that have occurred throughout history. And I want to show them because it might highlight to you things that migrant workers might bring up to you. So the first one you'll see there is what's called chattel slavery, which is really what it sounds like, treating someone as if they're not human. So it's a permanent form of servitude or slavery where that person is owned by someone else. They're bought and sold like an object. And that is a direct contravention of our Canadian human rights, where no person is to be owned by another person. However, other countries may have different levels of protections and laws. The second form is debt bondage or bonded labor. This is very common. So an exploitive financial loan is given in exchange for services, and they're forced to pay off that debt. How this typically turns out for migrant workers is they're offered a job in Canada, but they have to pay a significant recruitment fee to get that job. And so they often don't have the money to cover the cost of that. We've heard of recruitment fees up to $30,000 Canadian. And I want to be very clear, it is illegal in Canada to charge a recruitment fee to have a job here. That actually is an illegal practice. And so what happens for individuals from other countries, foreign nationals, is they're not able to pay that loan. So they're told, okay, well, you can come and work it off. So now you have someone in Canada who's here for a job and they're not being paid because they're working off a loan, and the loan's not even legal to begin with. Sometimes we also see that that loan continues and increases in amount. The last form I want to talk about is contract slavery. It's an agreement or a contract, and there's exploitive conditions. So this might be when a worker says, okay, I will take that job that only pays $6 an hour, which is under the minimum wage in British Columbia. But I need the job. I need it. I need it desperately, so I'll take it. I'll take maybe the wages under the table. So there's an agreement, but it's exploitive. It's inherently exploitive. It doesn't matter if the workers agreed to it. That is not acceptable in British Columbia. And so what we see in these cases is the longer that goes on, where there's an exploitive contract, there's a gradual loss of the agency of that person. So the longer they're with that employer, often the worse it gets. There's also other forms of slavery that have happened throughout history, but I just wanted to point those three out because this is how human trafficking is modern day slavery. We see these exact same dynamics. So you've got your three main areas we've talked about. You can see that there's sexual exploitation. And I will say for migrant workers, that's definitely a lot lower. It may be between an employer and the worker that there's been some sexual exploitation. It also could be individuals who seek to come to Canada to engage in sex work that was already an intention of theirs, and then they're exploited when they get here. But in most cases with migrant workers, we're looking at labor exploitation. And you can see that can happen on a domestic level in homes. It can happen in commercial spaces. We've even had individuals exploited where they've been brought for a job, and once they get here, that job doesn't exist anymore. And so now they're actually working somewhere illegal, like a drug lab. So I want to share some warning signs of recruitment. When I say recruitment, that's the step before someone is exploited. These are the steps that we typically see happen. And the first one I already mentioned, illegal recruitment fees. So if you're working with a migrant worker and they have paid a sum to get a job in Canada, that is a warning sign, absolutely, that they might be recruited into labor exploitation. The second thing is that their immigration documents were coordinated completely by someone else. Often it's in a language that they actually can't read, and so they've just signed somewhere, believing that it says work permit. We've actually had a lot of cases where someone thought they were coming on a work permit, and it turns out they signed a visa, a student visa or a visitor's visa. And yet when they're here, they're actually working with a family or working with a business, which is going to put their status at risk here in Canada. The next warning sign to look for is discriminatory work contracts. So when someone's given a contract, and inherently in that contract, there's discriminatory components. So an example that happened in British Columbia was a pretty significant case that came before the Human Rights Tribunal, where a young female caregiver was given a work contract and was asked to keep her hair a certain length, to present female. She was told what religion she was allowed to practice and what languages she was allowed to speak. That is all discriminatory, and no employer is able to dictate those particular components unless it's something that's related to the workforce. For example, putting your hair back when you're working in, the food industry. But that's not what I'm talking about. I mean discriminatory, and in some cases, especially for females, it's sexualized. Another one is the job availability changes. So as I mentioned, you come to Canada for one job, but it turns out that's not the job that's available. Or maybe you're going to do that one job and you're going to do something else. You're going to care for this family member, but you're also going to clean this house. And you're also going to assist at the office. And you're also going to help at the corner store. All of a sudden, what you're here to do becomes very fuzzy. And then lastly, when there's coordinated networks of employment agencies that they have gone through. So we've seen migration patterns. And again, as we know, in Canada, we have workers coming from many different countries. We do see migration patterns, especially for Philippine workers or those that might be in Indonesia or those that might be in Dubai, coming through Hong Kong to Canada. And these employment agencies are the ones that are promising jobs, but they're also the ones charging recruitment fees. So every person is making a cut. And by the time the worker gets to Canada, they're already in a form of debt bondage. As you might be aware, if someone does come to Canada and they do experience exploitation and they do not have permanent status, there is actually some provisions. They can apply for a victim of trafficking in persons temporary resident permit. This is a permit that is offered to individuals who have gone through this experience, and you can see that there's certain levels of support. I will say that although the ministerial direction is that no police involvement is required, I will be honest that in practice, it has needed to involve police involvement, which is challenging because the victims can't really control what cases the police decide to investigate and which ones they don't. There's also a lot of circumstances of labor exploitation that happen in a domestic environment, so there's no cameras. So I will say that that's a bit challenging, but there is the VTIP TRP options, and we have had some individuals be able to obtain them. There also is in BC, as you are probably quite aware, we've got a new system of open work permits for temporary foreign workers at risk. It's a temporary project, but it looks like it may be coming for long term, which is excellent. And the last one is a long-term solution, which would be applying for a humanitarian and compassionate grounds permanent residency. This is a long process, and so an individual can be without status or in flux of status for quite a while. I will say, however, we have seen those who have experienced trafficking be considered and even accepted for this level of status. There also is your civil avenues for justice, your criminal and your civil. I'm sorry it's cut off a little bit there, but I'm hoping you can still read it. There first would be a human rights tribunal complaint. So this is filing a complaint that's based on a form of experienced discrimination. And this is often happening within the context of exploitation and trafficking. So in the case that I mentioned of the caregiver, there was actually exploitation and discrimination based on her gender, her nationality, and her status. Those who've been exploited for labor can also file a complaint with the Employment Standards Division and report a contravention of the Provincial Labor Code, but it has to be within 6 months of the event. And again, we have seen survivors who have filed complaints and been successful and been able to receive their back wages that are owed to them. And then lastly, one that's not as common would be suing a perpetrator and employer. And you can see that could happen either in civil resolution tribunal, small claims court, or Supreme Court. We see this happen more in the States than we do in Canada, primarily because there's quite a bit of pro bono legal support that's needed to pursue that avenue. There's also the criminal avenues for prosecution. And so you can see there that we do have a section in our criminal code, it's section 279, that's related specifically to human trafficking. And then we also have a provision in our Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, section 118. And so it is important to understand that when we're looking at both of these provisions, they are related to trafficking and not smuggling. Sometimes it can get a little bit confusing. People start to think it's about crossing borders, where trafficking is about measures of control to ensure that someone is being abused and exploited. That's what we're talking about when we mention trafficking. So just to give you an idea, how many cases of human trafficking have we seen before our Canadian courts? Right now, we've had 531, and I will mention a lot of law enforcement don't get their statistics in, so I actually think it's quite a lot higher than that. But you can notice that only 21 of those involve individuals who identify as foreign nationals. So we are seeing a real investment of resources towards domestic cases, especially cases involving sex trafficking. However, we really do see a need to continue to grow resources to investigate human trafficking for labor purposes. And so you can see of those active cases, there's 511 accused and 420 victims. It's important to notice that there is more perpetrators than victims. That often gives you an indication in labor exploitation. It often means that there's a network of exploitive employers, but it also can mean in sex trafficking that there's gang involvement. So there's multiple perpetrators. You can also see that in Canada, 1/3 are under the age of 18. So when we think about whether this issue is a vulnerability for migrant workers, yes, but it's also a vulnerability for their children. And so in Canada so far, there have been over 143 convictions. This does look good on paper, but I will say in reality, Canada is quite far behind other countries. In the US, for example, they're already in the thousands of convictions. And so we are still as a country developing protocols and really dedicating resources towards this issue. So to wrap this up, I always like to explain, to understand what's going on in exploitation, there's often an equation every time. So the equation could look like, firstly, a person having a core need that's not being met. And that core need for migrant workers is typically that they need to support their families, they need to support themselves. There also can be the intangible core needs, like love and belonging and acceptance and safety and family. And so sometimes there might be more than one core need, but often when we have an unmet core need, it can cause vulnerability. And we all should be able to relate to this because I'm sure none of us have had a perfect life or a perfect upbringing. At one point in our lives, we've definitely had a core need that's not been met. But when you have a protective community that comes around you, we can protect those areas of vulnerability. In a lot of cases of those who've been exploited, they don't have that protective community. They are on their own. Think about how many migrant workers come to Canada and don't know anyone. How many are new to the country? How many don't know the language or the resources available, haven't built cultural connection here yet? And so you can see that there would be vulnerability. And someone can come along with a false promise to meet that core need. That's typically where the employer comes in or when the recruitment agency comes in. And sometimes it's very overt, here's the job. And sometimes it's very covert, I'll help take care of your needs. Come move into our house and we'll find work for you to do, or come stay on the farm, there's other workers here, we'll find a job for you. So it looks like the solution to this person's problems. It looks like they're going to meet that unmet core need. And what happens when you combine those two is that that vulnerability can become exploited, and we can see human trafficking, violence, control, and abuse. I think something I always like to share is that people might look at this and go, okay, but if you're in a circumstance that goes so awful, why don't you leave? The reason often that it's not easy to leave exploitation is that there is a cycle going on, a cycle from the employer, the perpetrator, the trafficker, of reward and punishment. So reward might look like paying some wages and here's a little gift or a trinket from the family, but then you take that back and there's violence or there's abuse or there's threats, and then there's another reward and then it's taken back. Reward, punishment, reward, punishment. That's actually a very common abusive tactic we see in a lot of forms of abuse. The other thing I wanted to mention is that often the exploitation equation happens because of coercion. Coercion is very hard to spot. It's not as overt as violence. Coercion is subtle or perceived threats that are used to instill fear or control. And I want to show you a few that survivors have shared with us. You can see that some of them here are more related to sexual exploitation, but I want to read the one in the middle. This one was actually said to a client that we walked with. The employer said to her, "Because your visa is tied to me as your employer, the police have a nasty habit of deporting housekeepers who don't listen." So you can see that the threat is deportation, that I'm going to report you. But really what the control is that you're going to do what I say. If you're not listening to me, I actually can damage your status and your pathway to residency here in Canada. But you can see that it's subtle. It's not outright. They haven't outright done it yet. That's what coercion typically looks like. And it's very, very challenging. So we talked about warning signs of recruitment. I want to share with you warning signs that someone might be being trafficked. So it's actually happening to them. These are the ones to look for. Works excessively long or unusual hours with no breaks. They don't have a defined job description. They work in dangerous conditions. So they're working somewhere with no safety equipment, no WMIS training. They're asked to do very dangerous tasks with no proper supports or team to do that with. No private living quarters. This is very, very common. In a lot of cases we're seeing across Canada, forcing workers to live together or live with the employer, and they don't have a private space. Live-in caregivers are very vulnerable to this, and we need to ensure that they have rooms with locks on them so that they actually have their own private space. Maybe the individual is not free to come and go. So their time outside of work is not their time outside of work. So you're trying to book an appointment to meet with them, and yet in the weekdays or even on the weekend, they're not able to come and meet you. They might have no control over meals or access to food. So maybe their employer is either restricting their access to food or they're just not able to. It also can be an indication that they're not making any of the money that they're actually working for. They also might owe a large debt and tell you that they have a debt that they're paying off. Usually that's the recruitment fee. They might not be allowed to engage with the public or with their family or in community. We've often seen employers tell a worker that they're not allowed to speak in their native tongue. They can only speak in the language of the employer, which again is going to limit their communication. We have had traffickers be in the room where their victims can call home to their family, but they're not able to tell them what's going on because the trafficker is in the room. They may have very few personal possessions, which again shows you that they're not setting up a life here. They don't have access to the money that they're actually making. They have no control over their finances or their essential ID. So if they do not have their ID on them and someone is holding it for safekeeping, that is a major warning sign. The last one is, we had talked about that. There's a large debt and they're not able to pay it off no matter how much they work. So that would actually show you that there's an ongoing debt, that they don't just have a recruitment fee, they also have to continue to pay for things like where they're living and transportation, all things that are starting to add up to really high amounts. You know, taking public transportation doesn't cost $60 a day, but that might be what they're getting charged by the employer. So one thing I do want to mention is that when someone is being exploited, they're typically in what's called external chaos. There might be violence. In very few cases of migrant worker, there might be some level of addiction. We see that very commonly in sex trafficking. But typically they're in an environment of danger and exploitation. So they're constantly in the unknown and unexpected. They're focused on staying safe. If you remember that quote from earlier from Louisdale, she said that she just put a mask on every day because she just needed to show up and do her work, no matter how awful the conditions were. And so what happens is the worker themselves is in this constant state. It becomes a cycle that you can't get out of. And so there's no time to deal with what's going on inside. It's only outside. You're only trying to keep yourself safe. And so what happens when you come into the middle? Maybe there's been some kind of intervention, whether it's the police, maybe the worker has fled, maybe there's been assistance, employment standards, or WorkSafe has shown up. And so that worker now leaves that environment and they're brought into safety and rest and they're given food and the external chaos goes quiet. One thing you need to be prepared for is that that can feel good for about 3 days. What comes afterwards is a very common psychological phenomena with trauma, which is that the internal chaos starts to come up really loud. Those years of stored abuse that they may have experienced, whether that's abuse when they were young, whether that is forgotten memories that are resurfacing, maybe it's actually flashbacks or triggers that are coming up based on what they experienced before. It may cause them to want to engage in some form of self-harm. They might have nightmares. It might result in disordered eating. It also might result in suicidal ideation or attempts. And I will say many survivors of labor trafficking that we've worked with have actually experienced all of those things on the list. And it feels awful. Often the worker feels like, why did I leave? I feel worse than before. Usually it just means that actually they're now in a safe place and they're starting to process what's happened to them. Human trafficking is a serious and egregious and brutal, brutal crime. It has serious impacts on someone. And so these are some of the things that you can expect if you do come across a trafficked person. They don't always present as someone who is sweet and kind and really wants your help. Often they're very mistrusting. They've definitely been abused really seriously. And so they may have a very intense fear and desire to keep the job. They don't want to leave. They may reject or sabotage supports. They may withhold information from you or flood information. They may be confused about the abuse timeline when it happened. And again, that's normal as well. When you've experienced a lot of trauma, it's common for the amygdala in your brain, which is the fear center. It's on fire when you've experienced a lot of trauma, and it takes time for it to calm down, which means things don't always come out in the right sequence. And usually it takes a few months until all the timelines start to lay out properly. And you also might see that an individual may have really severe rising mental health concerns or even addictions. That's very common when recovering from trafficking. So I want to give you some tips and then tell you a little bit about our programs and end for today. How do we heal the exploitation equation? We go back to that core need that wasn't met in the first place, and we seek to meet it in a healthy way. So whether that was a job, we seek to assist with legal remedies so that victims of labor trafficking can actually go into a job and into the workforce in a non-exploitive way. Maybe it was safety or family or love or belonging, seeking to help those who've experienced this to rebuild that sense of safety, to build connections in the community, which is something that you already do through all of your services. And secondly, to be trauma-informed supports. So today we've talked about trauma. We talked about what it looks like to be understanding and accommodating. And when we do that, we protect their vulnerability and there's gradual healing. So here's a step-by-step guide to support survivors. I apologize. I have a phone that keeps ringing on this side and I'm not sure how to turn it off. My apologies. So the first thing is prepare ahead of time, which is what you're doing today. Get educated and know the warning signs. Maybe you need to have a policy that specifically outlines what you do when a trafficked person comes forward. The second is to have your list of supports: housing, detox, healthcare, legal, immigration, and ensure that you have it ahead of time, because when someone comes forward who's been exploited, they need a lot and they need it right away. And they often come to your office Friday at 4 p.m. We're just coming up to the weekend, but they need that assistance right away. So if you're already prepared, that's the best thing that you can do. I'd also recommend putting a little bit of funding aside for those who have been victims of trafficking, because often they already have lapsed status, so they're not able to work, and they have a lot of needs. And so typically it's a little bit more expensive than what you would normally budget for clients. I would encourage you to keep that aside. I would also say when the survivor comes forward, the first thing you do is listen. Nothing that complicated. Listen, and then secondly, normalize the experience and have a no shame, no shock approach. There's actually nothing worse than someone coming forward and telling you about trauma, and your response is that you're shocked and you're visibly and emotionally overwhelmed. What you want to do is say, thank you for telling me. We're aware this has happened to other people, and we're so appreciative that you trusted us to tell us, and we want to be able to help you. I also would say that you don't have to ask more questions than you need to. You know, we're not law enforcement. We don't need to ask every single piece. Obviously, if you are coordinating legal support, that's different. But I will say when someone's coming out of exploitation, they're pretty traumatized. And so you want to take it slow. Often the details will come out over time. The next step is to ask them what they want. Suggest first stage support. So really just think about food, shelter. What do they need right now? They might need something long-term, like a job, but that might be a month from now. What do they need today, right now? Then coordinate those supports for them. And I'm going to show you a program that we have that you're welcome to access, and we can help you with that. I would also say I can send you some resources around if you're working with someone that's really traumatized, to be able to teach them how to cope and ground so that they don't engage in things like self-harm, suicidal ideation. And lastly, be very careful not to make promises you can't keep. This is already a population who've had a lot of promises made to them. And so be forthright, be straightforward, make sure that you build a network. You're not just the one service that's helping them. They're going to need a lot more than you. And then lastly, stick it out. It is common for those who are exploited to consider going back to their exploiter. We obviously don't want to see that happen, but be aware it can happen and be willing to help them when they're reaching out for help again. So I want to finish today just telling you a bit about our programs. We actually run a series of anti-human trafficking rehabilitation programs. Our programs, even though they are from the base of the Salvation Army, they're not Christian programs, and they have no religious requirements. Our entire staff team and our clients are very diverse. And so you can see here we've actually got a group of services, but I'm just going to show you one or two today that's the most relevant for you. So when you're looking at how to support a survivor, oftentimes we get a little bit ahead of the game. And so for us, we've always focused on these two areas. What are their emergent needs right now? And then what's the next step? How do we help them stabilize? How do we get them to a level where they can access some basic counseling, some longer term housing, some addictions programming if they have addictions, to start building community, make sure they have primary medical care. And then you'll notice reintegration and transition comes afterwards. So make sure when you see, if someone comes forward to your programs, make sure that you look at the first needs first. What's emergent and what will help them stabilize after this experience. We also, and something you can look at later, we practice trauma-sensitive care. Trauma-informed care is an excellent goal. It means that you're aware of trauma and that you are providing support and safe places for people who've experienced trauma, which is very common. In fact, most of us in this world have experienced trauma. Trauma-sensitive is a next step. It actually means that you accommodate your programs to support someone who has trauma. So I'll give you an example. In our programs, we actually don't start anything until 10 a.m. in the morning. And that's because many of our clients have nightmares and flashbacks all night. They're exhausted. They have very poor sleep hygiene. And so for them, this is our way of giving them a chance to succeed in programming. So when it starts at 10 a.m., they can have those few extra hours in the morning to sleep. So that might be similar for something you to consider in your programs. How can we make it easier for survivors of trafficking to access? So the service I'd most recommend to all of you is our New Hope Outreach Service. These are roving case managers who will work with any exploited person anywhere in Canada. It could be for labor, for sex, male, female, trans, children, families, two-spirit, non-binary folks, anyone in between, and we will help build a network of support around them. If you're already their primary care support, that's great. We'll come alongside and assist you. But if the individual doesn't have any support, we're going to help them. And you can see that typically they reach out for help, they might access supportive services, and move towards exiting. We also have a labor trafficking project with Migrant Workers Center. So we actually have some of our outreach staff who are on site at Migrant Workers Center 3 days a week. So if you have clients who need to access the legal supports of Migrant Workers Center who are being exploited, they'll actually be able to be referred directly through Migrant Workers Center to our program. And the same that we'll also do the other way around. So if someone reaches out to us, we'll make sure that they're referred to free legal services through Migrant Workers Center and some other agencies as well. The last program I want to share with you is our live-in program, which means it's a residential program. It's called Deborah's Gate. It is a high security rehabilitation program for those who are fleeing a trafficker and want to start recovery. We accept survivors of labor trafficking and sex trafficking. The program is completely free. We fundraise to cover the cost. We have a full 24/7 trained staff with trained therapists on our team, as well as medical professionals outside of our program who consult. And we accept referrals from any agencies, including yours. I will say that when we started this program, we weren't full. There wasn't a lot of identification of trafficking in Canada. But over the past few years, we've seen a significant increase in referrals. So we do have a wait list for the program. However, I would encourage you to still put a referral form in, because when a bed opens up, we start calling down that wait list, and sometimes people are not ready to come. And so we definitely had clients sneak into a bed a lot quicker than you'd expect. And I also will say that the province of British Columbia has seen that this need is increasing, and we're actually going to be opening another 20-bed facility, hopefully by the end of 2019. So stay tuned. We hope to have more available. Lastly, we have quite a few other initiatives and programs that are available to our clients. You can see some there, everything from free dental clinics to pet therapy, registered counseling. And again, I want to remind everyone, these services are for those who are migrant workers or Canadians who have experienced exploitation or trafficking. So these are specialized to that experience and to the recovery through that experience. I want to end with this. Today has been a lot of bad news. Human trafficking is a very difficult subject, but I only work in this field because I believe and I see hope for transformation, hope that we can end human trafficking in Canada, that we can protect migrant workers, and we can help those who are experiencing exploitation to leave that circumstance and to live an extraordinary life. And you'll notice that I have a list there of things that have happened in survivors' lives who have started to pursue recovery. Just because someone's experienced trafficking does not mean that that's the end for them. It doesn't mean that their life is ruined. We truly believe that no matter what's happened, everything can be redeemed, renewed, and restored. So if you'd like more information of how to refer to us, you can go to our website, deborahsgate.ca, and there's lots of information and lots of resources on trafficking on that website. And I want to end with a survivor's voice again today. This is Lou Adele, the same person who shared her story before. And I want to read this out to you as a way to give us some empowerment and hope. Lou Adele said, as a labor trafficking survivor, I want to tell other survivors that they can all join in the fight against human trafficking if they don't stay silent. I want them to feel there is hope and they are no longer alone. They just need to believe in themselves. We all deserve a life of dignity and respect. We are not merchandise or anyone's property. To everyone who's hearing my voice, I survived and you will survive. The world is waiting for us to explore and make a difference. Thank you so much for participating today. I would like to open up for a question and answer period.
Thank you, Larissa. Thank you for sharing your presentation, for taking us through some of the different aspects of recognizing and assisting victims of labor trafficking, and for also ending it with Lou Adele's story of hope. Thank you for that. So we're now going to be coming to our question and answer session for this webinar. And so we ask that you please submit your questions for Larissa using the GoToWebinar question box. You can either tweet your questions using the hashtag AMSA events, or you can alternatively email your questions to events@amsa.org. So we've been receiving a few questions. And so Larissa, the first question really comes up in terms of some of the procedures and those internal processes and policies that you mentioned. Are there any steps or examples of these processes that organizations should have or should look to implement in terms of dealing and supporting somebody who has been a victim of labor trafficking?
That's a great question, and I have some suggestions, although it's going to change depending on your agency. So you're always welcome to reach out to me and I can assist you with some more tips that we've helped other agencies develop. The first thing I already mentioned is putting a little bit of funding aside and having some policy of how that's used. So to give you an example, you may have someone with lapse status who's going to need to reapply, and there's costs to reapply, yet they haven't been paid by their employer for months. So you're going to want to keep a little bit of a fund aside. They also might need to, they might need transportation costs, especially if, say, for example, they're in a remote work camp or on a farm and they need to actually come into the city to come and see you and to meet with you. Some other policies I'd recommend is, number one, a trauma-informed approach. So what that means is that if you're working with a migrant worker and you suspect that there might be some elements of labor trafficking, number one, that you book more time for that appointment. You're going to need it. Typically, someone who's experienced that, it's going to be it's not going to be a quick stop in and meeting. I think number two, have a resource list ready and handy that's specific to those who've experienced labor exploitation and trafficking. Just trust me on this one. Typically, they come forward and there's so much that they need. They might need housing that night. They might need food vouchers. They might need clothing. They might need immediate medical attention. So having some steps in place and some resources. And what that usually looks like is you call those agencies in your community ahead of time and talk to them and say, would you see a trafficked person who doesn't have identification? So we do that. We'll call local clinics and say, will you make an exception for this population? And not everyone says yes, but we try to work to make those accommodations. The other thing I would say is to make sure that all staff are trained to understand the warning signs. Because if you don't spot them or pick them up, usually the person is being victimized, they don't know what's happening, so they're not going to be the one to tell you. The last thing that I would say is to have some strategies in place for your team to help someone learn a way to cope with the anxiety and the trauma that they're experiencing. So this is pretty common that settlement agencies call us and say, I have some in my office and they're totally overwhelmed and they're threatening to hurt themselves and they're feeling afraid. And so I can send at the end of the session to the conference organizer a list of really simple coping and grounding tools, everything from deep breathing to how to manage anger, to how to be able to process anxiety, all kinds of different tools that are very simple. You don't have to be a therapist to use them, that you could actually very easily show a client and help them be able to process and manage, because outside of their meeting with you, they're going to have all of these fears and memories and anxiety and trauma coming up. So you want to prepare them for that. So those are some of the suggestions. However, I'd be happy to help individual agencies come up with a few more that are specific to your services.
Okay, thank you, Larissa, and also thank you for volunteering and allowing agencies to contact you directly to seek more clarification or some other examples. One other question that we received is in regards to Deborah's Gate. And the question is, does Deborah's Gate provide training for staff from other organizations as well?
Yes, we do. Our agency, actually, all of our programs, we do offer different levels of training and training events. We do have one that's even coming up this week that there's a few seats left. So again, I can send that to the conference organizers. And if anyone is able to come this Thursday, we're happy to offer you a complimentary ticket. I believe we've got 3 or 4 seats left to an all-day training. We also are happy to coordinate that for your agency. We do have a lot of requests, so we might have to plan a little bit in advance, but that's okay. Sometimes we'll also put on another webinar event that might be longer and more specific, or we'll come in person. So yes, we are happy to discuss that and take a look at that. And if it's local, we're happy to do that. No charges or no costs, but if it requires a bit of travel, we might have to figure out between our agencies just to cover the cost of that. We do try to apply for some funding so that we can go to more remote communities, go onto the island. So again, if you just want to reach out to us, it always starts with a host agency that is willing to have us. And we will be also presenting at an event in Victoria that's coming up at the end of April. That's also for settlement agencies. So I can send that information to the conference organizer as well.
Perfect. Thank you, Larissa. And we'll make sure also to disseminate that to organizations in those regions who may be interested in participating. A further question that we received is, do you find that municipal, provincial, and federal authorities who work or interview survivors, for example, who interview them as part of the open work permit in BC, are trained to understand the impact of trauma on survivors, in that their account may not correctly convey the sequence of events, which somebody may view as a survivor lying?
I really appreciate that you bring that up. I want to be careful not to make a sweeping judgment and say no across the board. We have come across certain individuals who've experienced training and they have handled these cases very well. We've also seen quite a few, whether it's an IRCC member or a CBSA, who has not been educated or trained on the signs and has interpreted some of those impacts of trauma as dishonesty. That's unfortunate. It actually happens in the criminal system as well with law enforcement. We often want things in a nice time sequence, you know, this month and this day, but trauma happens in a cycle. And so when someone describes it to you in a cycle, it's very hard to kind of figure out what was the clear timeline. And usually just means that that individual needs some time. They need some time to for their brain to calm down. I think that there needs to be an increase in education, and we have partnered, I will say, certain agencies, certain branches of CBSA and law enforcement have been very open to training and have really been trying to be as sensitive as possible. We've also seen some that definitely need some support and assistance in that area. So the more that we want to advocate for that, I would encourage it.
Well, thank you, Larissa. So we have one further question, and I am aware that it's 11 a.m. and that the official time for our webinar has passed for the ending of it. So we totally understand that if you're not able to continue being part of the question and answer period. However, we do want to honor some of the questions that we have received, and Larissa has agreed to continue providing answers where possible to some of these. And so one question that we received, Larissa, is in regards to somebody who's working on the front line and working with clients. How and they maybe have an idea that thinks that somebody could be a victim of trafficking,
Mhm.
how could that individual who's working on that front line look to approach somebody and bring up that conversation? Um, and how could they identify some of those signs that somebody may be the victim of trafficking?
Yeah, I think I'm really glad someone asked that because it is actually about your approach. If you just kind of come at someone and ask them a million questions and come off a little bit strong, that may just cause them to kind of clam up even more. And as you know as well, we have workers from all different countries. So having a culturally sensitive approach, I'd recommend a few things. Some migrant workers come from cultures where eye contact face to face is very uncomfortable, or maybe they've been exploited and they haven't really felt equal to other people. And they often feel more comfortable sitting side to side versus face to face. So we've done that before. We'll sit at a table and we'll just actually sit next to a client versus sitting across from them. So that's one tip I would just say to be sensitive to if you notice that there might be something going on, but they're a little bit uncomfortable to talk about it. The second thing is I wouldn't ask hundreds of questions. I'd ask a few simple questions. I would ask, are you being treated fairly? Are you being paid for your wages appropriately? And are you making a minimum wage? Those would be some of the similar, and I even ask, do you know what minimum wage is? For a lot of people who are labor exploited, they don't even know that in Canada it's very different than other countries. Or they might have been in another province and now they're in BC and it's different. If they're open to those questions, I might ask a few more. I might say, do you have your own private living space? Do the employers come into that space? Do you live with other workers? Some workers, they're not living with their employer or around their employer, but some, that's the warning sign to look for. I would also take a lot of breaks. We don't want to interrogate someone who's been exploited. And so for us, we often make a cup of tea. Like I said, book yourself some extra time to talk with them. Sometimes we'll take a survivor for a walk, and they're more comfortable to walk and talk than to actually be in the office kind of face to face. It's a little bit scary for them. Or it might be on the phone as well. So if it's on the phone, we always check in every few minutes and just say, are you still safe to talk on the phone? We also, would talk a little bit about what their goals are. So not just talking about, what's the abuse they've gone through. We would start to ask them questions like, you came to Canada. What were some of your goals when you came to Canada? And sometimes when you reorient the conversation about why they originally came, it causes them to be able to reflect more on what's going on now. The last thing I would say is the best strategy is to normalize the experience. And I know there's nothing normal about exploitation. I'm not saying it's normal. It's awful. And every time I hear it, I'm shocked. And it's been 15 years. But to the individual that's coming forward, that shock to them can mean shame. And so we have to have a good game face where our face doesn't show that level of shock or horror or disgust. And instead, what we say to them is, we've actually heard that this has happened to others. You're not alone. That's very comforting when you've experienced something that feels very awful and shameful and embarrassing, when you realize it isn't just me. And even, oh, it's actually happened to other workers and I could get help. And it's okay. There's actually people that would care about me and there actually is supports for me. So I would actually say that that's just one other strategy I would recommend, is to normalize the experience. Even if afterwards you need to go and debrief with another staff member and you're feeling totally overwhelmed and shocked at what you heard, try your best not to let that individual see all of that shock. Try instead to be supportive and go, it's not about me today, it's about them. And what do they need in this very moment? How can I help them in this moment? That's what I would recommend.
Well, thank you, Larissa. Thank you for sharing and for really helping everyone start to learn about recognizing and assisting victims of labor trafficking. We're really aware of the fact that we really only started to cover this topic and that it's not a full covering of this topic. But what we made this start today. So I would just like to, before we close, just thank everyone for joining today's event and for sending and participating in the poll polls and for sending in all of your questions. And we will be emailing participants an online evaluation form following this webinar. So we request that you please take the time to fill it out, as AMSA relies on the feedback in our evaluation forms to plan future events and topics. And I'd like to say a special thank you to Larissa. Thank you so much, Larissa, for taking part in today's webinar and for sharing your time and expertise with individuals who are working to support migrant workers. I'd also like to thank the AMSA team, to Khan, to Melissa, and to Alejandra for participating and putting this webinar together. Also stay tuned for the launch of our new Migrant Worker Hub website, where we will be sharing resources like this webinar for organizations that support migrant workers, employers, workers, and everyone working to support migrant workers. And so if you have any questions or would like to be added to the mailing list, please send an email to Alejandra Paramo with your contact details. And Alejandra's email is aparamo@amsa.org, and she will look to sign you up and make sure that you receive updates on the project that AMSA is taking the lead on in terms of supporting capacity, building capacity to support migrant workers in BC. And so before we finally close the webinar, I would just like to move to the last slide. And just once again, thank the Government of Canada through the Migrant Worker Support Network program for funding today's event. So thank you everyone for joining, and hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.